program, Freely and Critically, conducted by me, Tomas Kavaliauskas, and Professor Gintautas Mažeikis. Today, our special guest is Associate Professor from the Department of Cultural Studies, Valentina Gueorguieva, who kindly agreed to spend some time talking to us about Bulgarian minority rights, Bulgarian situation for various minorities. Also, of course, we will have this cultural anthropological approach to our conversation. Professor Gintautas, perhaps you would like to ask our guest the first question. Your microphone is on.
Valentina, nice to see you. And actually, we're interesting about, contemporary situation with subcultural and other minority groups movements in Bulgaria. What do you see? What kind of problems do you see here, and what's kind of challenges they make or don't make for the society in order to understand the field of your research?
Thank you, first of all, for inviting me. It is a real pleasure to talk to you. And also thank you for this interesting question about the subcultural groups. To be honest with you, during these last 2 years, we were overwhelmed by political torments, and it is a real happiness for me to come back to my work about subcultural groups. Well, I don't think Bulgaria is very, very different from what's going on in a global context in the cultural industries. And like a couple of years ago, I saw empirically a significant decline in fandoms. There used to be in Bulgaria some big rock and roll concerts with some large groups of audiences moving around the Balkans just to join in a festival and see their favorite band. Unfortunately, these big mega rock events stopped existing sometime in 2015, 2016, even before COVID. And I was very interested in this process, and I kind of interviewed a couple of people, including the organizers. And they said that for commercial reasons, they couldn't continue with these big festivals for rock fans because they need bigger groups of people. They need to fill in stadiums. And if up to 2010-11 it was easily feasible, it was very easy to gather something like 20,000 people at the same stadium. After that date, it became more and more difficult or even impossible. So for Sofia Music Enterprises, the enterprise that organized Sofia Rocks, for example, they said it's no longer commercially interesting to do these mega events. It's a pity for the fans. It's a pity for the exchange of ideas, for the gathering together, for building up communities of fans. But it is what it is, and it is a reflection of the general trends into the cultural industries lately. I see it in the direction of the evolution of new means of communication, of more and more, how do I say, consumption of cultural products into very small, very specialized communities, into smaller genre, into not like big idolatric fan cultures, but the more a product is specialized, the smaller the community of fans. So we have new forms of communication, like the Korean webtoon, for example. You know it probably, it's a comic strip that you stroll a lot. And then there are people who don't know nothing about these specific niche communities of fandoms. So we are witnessing a fragmentation of fandoms that goes after the evolution of new technologies and new genres. And this is why we cannot see any more large festivals.
Yeah, but do you see, Valentina, that you know that you remember that this sexual revolution, which coincide with 1968 revolution in French, you know, and as well as early and late in America, San Francisco, everywhere. And this sexual revolution collected even 100,000 of participants of festivals, you know. But contemporary sexual revolution probably more related with such application like Tinder, you know, to find and which completely is alienated, you know, and from the one side and from the other side, it's so easy to understand sexual partnership. So does it mean that Tinder and other applications, they destroyed the ideals of sexual revolution and the, you know, fence movement? This is metaphorical question, please.
Thank you. That's another excellent question. Thank you. It makes me think about it. I don't think that we need to be pessimistic about it, because apart from Tinder, there is also Grindr, and a part of these, you know, specific channels of communication, there is also for the younger generation TikTok, and there is also, if you don't want to get into sexual thing but just want to listen to music, you can have Spotify, Deezer, whatever. So it's really a proliferation of means of communication that gets the audience into very small fragments.
But does it mean that this fragmentation means as well, you know, some kind, not only the new level of comfort, you know, but from the other side, a new level of cynicism and, you know, body alienation, losing of, so as philosophy says, body consciousness?
It's true that digital communication lacks something, and it lacks something related to the body. But let's not blame it only on digital communication, because for the last 3 years we are enclosed in our homes because of some other reasons. And it's, how do I say, it's a troubling issue, but I would still not be very pessimistic about it. We still have every means of communication, and it's up to the cultural practices that we choose. If you see what I mean, it's not the technology that determines our behavior. It's our cultural patterns of behavior that would rather go and choose the technology. So I still believe that even though our bodily movements are restricted, we are still conscious cultural beings with a large selection of choices.
From the other side, you know, that this my examples, which I mentioned starting from 60s, presuppose some territorial participation. And today, probably we could speak about internationalization, online internationalization. It could be some networking, online networking in Europe, which means probably origin of new style of groups. But how is it with their festivity, with their festivals, happiness, you know, if they are very international? Do they could solve just only problems, or, you know, to advertise some products, you know, or could they feel some level of happiness on friendship, if you would like, on this international networking?
Speaking of the project on the festivalization of culture that we had here in Bulgaria a couple of years ago, we more or less find out that there is every small city in Bulgaria has its own festival, and it's for very touristic commercial reasons again. Yeah, but my specific field of study as part of this project was more or less those international mega rock events that didn't happen anymore. That was why I was disappointed. The scale is important also from the point of view of experience. When you have tens of thousands of fans, or even hundreds of thousands of fans at the same stadium, you have a more impressive show. with the lights, with the special effects, with it's really like the opening of the Olympics. The scale is important for the experience itself, and also for the feeling that you're at the same place with 10,000s of people more. This is what we lost. This sense of community definitely we lost, and I think we miss it.
Ordinary, when we are speaking about such big audiences in Baltic countries as well, so-called song festivals, and we mentioned about so-called ecstatic experience. That ecstatic means that when you are in small groups, it's very easy. It's very difficult to experience this ecstatic experience. But when you listen, thinking together 100,000 people, like you immediately start to feel very strong euphoria here. You know, that's some kind like sanctity, some religious feeling, and you couldn't experience this one through your Spotify listening. You know, it's very difficult, or it's very difficult only for one or the other case. It is possible. Does it mean that people less interesting in ecstatic culture, you know, or some ecstasies? Or what could it mean for the society, this disappearance of common happiness, common euphoria?
Very nicely put, this ecstatic experience. I wouldn't have the words for it, and thanks to a philosopher, I found it. Well, I believe there are like two parallel things going on. Spotify is a day-to-day experience of music. It's the everyday practice, while the big event, the ecstatic experience, comes only once in a lifetime, or every summer, or every festival. It's like the time when you go out of the ordinary. So I believe both can run together.
Yeah, and okay. The more question about, you know, the political side of what you're talking, because it's not only fan groups of musicians, but as well about the different interest group. For example, LGBTQ and their festivals. There, you know, some movements, and there we see it's easy to see some political issues of that such kind of movements and festivals, like Pride festivals. What is the situation in Bulgaria about it?
There are two things that I would like to talk to in answer to your question, but I will start with the LGBT rights. The curious thing about the situation during the last 3 years under COVID is that the only event that still gathered bigger masses of participants is Sofia Pride. Sofia Pride back in 2016 had something like 6,000 participants. Then 2018, 700 participants. Then in 2020, there was no Sofia Pride because of, you know, coronavirus. And 2021, 10,000 participants in Sofia Pride. And it's true that there are a lot of critics, especially on the left side of the political spectrum, against this kind of event, that it has become commercial, that it has lost its political sense of revolt, of vindication of rights. But at the same time, it's a very festival, really, very merry, very ecstatic in the sense that you described earlier. And it's very, very important for a community which is regularly under attacks. So on a daily basis, LGBT people in Bulgaria experience a lot of discrimination, and I'm ready with some statistical data here to show you this discrimination. But there is one time in a year, and it's in June, and it's in Sofia Pride, that people come together and feel safe and feel ecstatic and enjoy the right to be. So these statistical data are from the Eurobarometer on discrimination in 2019, so more or less recent survey. And here we have the question, Can gay, lesbian, bisexual people can have the same human rights as heterosexual people? You know, basic question about human rights. And in Bulgaria, it appears that 84% do not agree, which is a significant proportion of the situation. I have more or less a lot of data here, and I believe everyone, data from Eurobarometer are free on the internet, everybody consult them. I believe this is striking data.
But what would be your hypothesis? What is the reason, or better to say, maybe at least correlation for that kind of attitude? Is it Bulgarian Orthodox Church that perhaps is somehow re-echoing Russia's Orthodox Church, which is very much anti this our human right extension for gay and lesbian and transsexual culture, or is it some kind of still lingering post-communist mentality being behind all the trends in Western European cities? What is the reason, or perhaps at least maybe what is the correlation for what it correlates, perhaps?
It is a complicated combination of factors, of course. The answer to this question is can go into multiple levels. But I was curious to see, because recently we had this small study about the very first publication of human rights organization back in the 90s and in the early 2000s. And what was curious to see is that back then, 20 or 30 years ago, the narrative was more tolerant towards LGBTI people. Yeah, of course, there is always the layer of conservatism, of post-communist values, of like people living in small towns who are not so eager to accept a difference, or who have simply never met somebody who is different and react in a stereotypical way because they don't have the experience of other human beings, which are slightly different. But it is very clear from these publications that we have reviewed from earlier date that on the level of media discourse, the narrative has changed. And it has changed during really very recently, since after 2018. When we have documented the first like very specific characteristic tropes or metaphors of the anti-gender discourse. Anti-gender campaigns exist in Europe since at least 2015, maybe even earlier. They are an international phenomenon. They are influenced by the Russian Orthodox Church, but equally strongly influenced by American neoconservative organizations, including the evangelical and Protestant churches. So they have had a very significant impact in Bulgaria in the Roma communities, for example, because the Orthodox Church is not interested in working with the Roma community. So it was very easy for those organizations, even back in the 90s, to start gaining influence during these communities. But it's not a secret that they received significant funding during the last couple of years in order to propagate this new conservative discourse on family values, on the rights of women and children, on it's difficult for me to reiterate these ground rules of the neo-traditionalist discourse.
And you know, what you mentioned about this neoconservatism, we discussed a lot with Thomas and our friends about this neoconservatism. And it's interesting, you know, that you remember maybe 10, 15 years ago, we spoke a lot about cultural diversities and about multiculturalism. We include subculturalization into cultural diversity and multiculturalism as new paradigms, the development of new styles of life and the new symbolism of new type of life. And then immediately we see maybe 3-5 years ago, the new waves of what we call populistic nationalism, or populistic nationalism, which which looks like counter-revolution or counter-reformation, you know, counter-progress activism, which destroys all these activities and so on. However, we couldn't say that it's old sort of intelligent conservatism. This is some kind of new type of, you know, populism, national populism. And how do you consider what is the role and what is the perspectives of this populist nationalism, which coincides with new conservatism in some one way or different? What's the future of this new wave? Could they destroy the diversity and multiculturalism of Europe? Is it a very big challenge? Is it, how do you think, it's very dangerous or not?
It is dangerous. I don't know if it's very dangerous, but it is dangerous. But because even when such nationalist, populist political parties are part of the incumbents, and they, especially in Bulgaria, they cannot hold for a very long time, because they win the elections with some kind of anti-systemic opposition, you know, the rhetoric against the traditional elites, etc., we the people. Then they go into power, and then, of course, they lose credibility because this anti-systemic discourse can no longer be supported. So they go out of power. So they lose power very quickly. This is what happens to it's a sequence of political parties in Bulgaria in that spectrum. But even if they're like ephemeral, they have a lot of impact. What they leave behind is a lot of damage. It is very, very dangerous. In this case, what they left behind, because after the last electoral cycle in Bulgaria in 2021, these older nationalist populist parties are no longer in parliament. There is a new one, but I will talk about it later. So what they left behind is this anti-gender discourse, and it is now embraced by the Bulgarian Socialist Party, and it is now embraced by other parties as well.
Considering that we started touching political parties and political programs, yesterday we had a conversation on our program with Latvian colleagues, and in Latvia, you know, there's this opposition between Latvians and Latvian Russians, two almost equally big populations with some common past, actually, of the experience of the Soviet Union and the experience of entering European Union together. However, they do identify themselves as two different ethnic groups with a lack of common identity. What is the situation in Bulgaria? I see that there is no second ethnic equally large group to Bulgarian nationality. However, they are Roma people, they are Turkish origin people who were born and grew up in Bulgaria, and perhaps some other ethnicities. How do you see this balance or disbalance in Bulgaria, and perhaps in comparison with the other Balkan countries?
Well, Bulgaria, just like other Balkan countries, is a multi-ethnical society, which behaves like a monocultural society, as if there were only one ethnical cultural group, the Bulgarians. So we are still into this paradigm of the nation state. The state belongs to the nation. But every Balkan country has minority issues, yeah, because we were so mixed historically. Turkish Muslim population and Roma people, to a certain extent, have political representation in the political party called the Movement for Rights and Liberties. It was established back in '89. It's one of the traditional parties, one of the oldest, with almost stable electoral result at every election cycle. And how do I say? It has the advantages and the failures of every political party nowadays. They are seen as corrupted. They are seen as distant from the people. They are seen as political opportunists from time to time. Yeah, it is problematic. But I would say the good news is that there is no binary opposition between, like, the Turkish minority party and the other political parties. It's not like either you are with us or you're with the enemies. It's not like the pro-Russian and against Russian parties. It's a more nuanced situation. Almost all of the political parties in the past have formed coalitions with this Turkish minority party, which I see as a positive effect of the democratic process. And what can I say?
Yeah. I would like to compare your answer, this one, with this situation about so-called Russian speakers in Lithuania. Not only in Lithuania, it could be as well in Latvia, but Lithuania is more representative case, because in the beginning of 90s, Lithuanians considered Russian speakers as some mono group, you know. And they considered themselves as well as some kind of Soviet Russian speakers, you know, even maybe Russian speakers, you know. But later what's happened, because the events of Ukraine and Belarus, they started to separate themselves into three very big groups, you know, into Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians between these Russian speakers. Then, because this migration process, these Russian groups as well split into pro-Putinist, anti-Putinist in Lithuania between Russians, as well difference about Belarusians. From the beginning, they don't like to speak Belarusian language, and they try to present themselves as the Russian speakers. And later, they started to more and more speak only Belarusian and even study Belarusian language in Lithuania, differently from Belarus, where they couldn't study Belarusian language sometimes. But Ukrainian group behave differently. They prefer more to speak Russian than Ukrainian. However, between them as well, more and more every year, this Ukrainian patriots in Lithuania. So we see very intensive dynamics in this group, and ordinary Lithuanian politicians, they are not so dynamic as these groups are dynamic, and they use very old stereotypes about Russian speakers, you know, and they couldn't understand that even pubs are different in Vilnius, where you could come with your Ukrainian language or with Russian language. If you will mix, it will be not very safe for you if you will mix. For Lithuanian who couldn't speak normally the Russian language, they mix. They don't understand sometimes even this small, you know, nuances even between pubs, you know, where could you to. And do you see the same, some kind of dynamics between national minorities in Bulgaria, that they on the development, the Turkish group are not the same, that probably 3 Turkish groups or so on.
Definitely. Definitely, I can see the same dynamics, and it's even more pronounced when we take into consideration the processes of migration. A lot of people are migrant workers somewhere in the European Union. There are huge diaspora of Turkish-speaking Roma ethnic groups in Düsseldorf, for example, or somewhere else in Germany. And for them, as they say in interviews with us, it's much more important to be fluent in Turkish in order to have a job somewhere in Germany than in Bulgarian. So it's very dynamic, and it's related to working conditions, living conditions, and it's no doubt that they would go into like this very difficult trajectory of migrant workers, because in Bulgaria they face a lot of discrimination. Would you like me to go into more details?
No, we no need. But you know, that's we could connect here. The first, my question, which was about populist nationalist, and you know, this dynamics of groups. You know, where we see development of some conflicts. You know, because populist ordinarily they use stereotypes, very stereotypic language about sexual minorities or national minorities or subcultural groups. They ordinarily use this. For example, in Lithuania, this ultra-rightist populists, they ordinarily call that all anarchists are terrorists, even if they never see no one anarchist in their life, you know. So we see in this sense the growing of political conflicts between minorities dynamics and populist nationalists in the parliaments, you know, and the politicians. And it's very in there. It's quite interesting to listen about this. What kind of conflicts you see? Do they understand each other? What does mean this new type of conflicts?
I'm afraid that if we choose to frame it in terms of conflict, we might think that there are actual, like, physical conflicts between groups. These happen, but before they happen on the level of discourse. They happen in terms of hate speech and in terms of negative stereotyping of groups of people. And it always starts with somebody with a voice, somebody who has the position to voice discontent or hatred towards some minority group. So it almost all of the time starts with politicians from the national populist spectrum. And they can invent a different scapegoats depending on the situation. In 2016, it was the refugees. Before that, it was the Roma people. The Roma people are a constant scapegoat, okay? Before that, it was Muslim minority. There were a series of attacks against mosques in Bulgaria. It didn't happen before, but in 2014, it happened for the first time in Plovdiv and then in Karlovo. Then in 2016 were the migrants. Then in 2018, it was the genders. You know, the term gender was manipulated. It was not translated into Bulgarian, but used as foreign word, gender, neologism, to designate somebody who is either LGBTQI or gender non-conforming. A woman that doesn't dress in a skirt can be designated as a gender. So they need this sort of artificially created monsters in order to fill in the cases of their discourse, of their narrative.
It looks like Plovdiv is very conflict even on the discourse sense city with anti-LGBT action, you know, this anti-Roma action that's different others. Why this city it's so conservative and populist? Or
I'm very sad to realize that Plovdiv has become something different than what I experienced when I lived there. Uh, Plovdiv used to be a really multicultural city with a huge Armenian community and a huge Jewish community, with a lot of Turkish and Muslim people still living there, with 2 or 3 separate quarters inhabited by Roma people. It is still the fact. And like during the last decade, it almost changed its face. I still believe that Plovdiv is a multicultural city. But it's true that these attacks that we see on the physical level that follow after the discursive level, they have happened in Plovdiv. And what is very striking is that you know that Plovdiv was the European capital of culture. There was a peaceful demonstration against an artistic event, an exhibition, Balkan Pride. It was a peaceful demonstration. People with posters who were defending the traditional family were opposing this exhibition because it creates for the foreigners, the tourists who come to visit Plovdiv, a manipulated version of their city. Their city is not LGBT. City, it's like the city of traditional values. So this was, I was there, I was not threatened, I felt okay, and I said, okay, that's their right of expression, it's fine. Everybody has a right of expression, as long as it's peaceful. The problem appeared in 2019, or was it 2020, where some random teenagers in the park were attacked by an organized group of teenagers, again, because they looked like gay. We don't know if these girls were lesbians, but in the eyes of this organized group of boys, they looked like LGBT people, and that was enough for them to attack them physically. After a couple of weeks, LGBT groups organized a demo on the street of Plovdiv to say that, yes, we are what we are, but we need to be safe. And it was again attacked by rather important groups of fans who demonstrated hate speech and violent behavior. The attacks were only prevented because the police was there. And I am in regular contact with LGBT people from Plovdiv. They live in the closet. They don't have a bar or a club of their own where they can go. They cannot have cultural events like exhibitions. They come to Sofia to have these cultural events. And this summer, 2021, all the cultural program of Sofia Pride was under attack by smaller or bigger groups of nationalists and football fans. I don't know who these people were. It's the police who knows. But the cultural events were under attack. Not the big march, though, because there are 10,000 people there. But the cultural events were under attack because there are smaller numbers of participants that can easily be intimidated by a group of 20 to 30.
For our viewers, I would like just to add that Plovdiv town has, in my eyes, the most beautiful old town. It is mesmerizing, and those who are listening to our conversation, I would like to encourage someday to visit Plovdiv just to see the old town, its beauty, how cozy the streets are. But now I'm afraid to encourage, after what I heard, I might be responsible for such a
but
nice
Thomas, you inspired me. I am inspired listening to you. I'm ordinary go even into conflict places. I like it, and if there is possibility to defend LGBT rights in Plovdiv, it's even good reason to go.
It's still safe to go in Plovdiv as a tourist. So I would also encourage all people, including LGBT people from abroad, to go to Plovdiv and visit. It's okay. It's safe. Don't worry. I would add a little hint about this old town. It's very multicultural from its origin. These beautiful houses were built by Bulgarians and Muslim people alike. Just after the independence of the Bulgarian state, some of them were left behind by those who chose to live in Turkey, those who migrated. And then they were bought by the incoming migrants from Armenia, the victims of the Armenian genocide, who came to live in Bulgaria as refugees, actually. They bought these houses and they inhabited them together with the remaining Turkish people and the Bulgarians. And also the Jewish part of the city is right attached. It's really next to it. So yes, Plovdiv was a really, how do I say, a melting pot. Although this expression is not very good, doesn't have a very good reputation nowadays, but it was an example of peaceful cohabitation of people from different ethnies and religions.
Yeah, it's nice to listen because I remember in this actually in last year I visited Mostar, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and actually it's not Sarajevo, but in any way Mostar could be compared with Plovdiv. And Mostar was one of the most cruel places in the Europe where Serbs, Croatians, and Muslims, fight it against each other in the period of few years, in very, very bloody war. And insofar as that, nevertheless, that they spoke, all of them, some sort of Serbs or Croatian Serbs language, the same language. So it's again, my question is about how it was successful Bulgarian case that you escape from Muslim Orthodox conflict. That's how could you explain your successfully policy in this sense between these two, Muslims and Orthodox?
There is this term, the Bulgarian ethnical model, coined by the first democratic president, Željo Želev, who was elected in 1991. And by coining this term, especially during the time when the Yugoslav war started, he wanted to insist that we have this successful model of cohabitating. I would say that underneath the surface, especially if you go back a couple of decades ago, into the 80s or even earlier, there is a lot of trauma. It's not so peaceful. There was successful waves of inciting Muslim people to leave Bulgaria, to leave behind all their property and go to Turkey. There is this so-called revival process back in the 80s where Muslim people were forced to change their names into Slavic-sounding names, not Muslim-sounding names. It was a forceful assimilation. And those of them who chose to leave, they were allowed to leave, but without their property. And even before, in the 60s, in the 50s, there were some discriminatory policies of the Bulgarian state regarding other minority groups, especially the Turks and the Muslims. They were like in focus, but also Roma people. And you can go as further back as the Balkan Wars, if you wish, and they happened in parallel with the First World War, with the Great War. And if you go back then, you will see that there was literally ethnic cleansing going on in the northern part of Greece, in the southern part of Bulgaria, in the eastern part of Turkey, in Macedonia, which is now a huge problem. But more or less, history has given us a lot of problems and has also created this illusionary vision of peacefulness that we inherit nowadays and that we call the Bulgarian ethnic model.
I think now it is an opportunity for me to shift towards a geopolitical question. During the Soviet times, Bulgaria used to be called like the 16th Republic of the Soviet Union, so friendly, so affiliated with Russia by the means of religion and Kirillitsa. How it is today, now that we are seeing so much military tension in the Black Sea, Bulgaria being a NATO country, and Russia, by threatening the war in Ukraine, demands Bulgaria, Romania to withdraw from NATO. As supposedly NATO has approached too close to Russian territory. Has this geopolitical situation influenced Bulgarian identity more towards NATO, European Union, allies with the United States? Has this memory of Bulgaria having identity as a friend of Russian Empire, as Russia participated in liberation from the Turks, has this change shifted in today's context with the threat to attack Ukraine? What is the position of Bulgaria?
It's also grounded back in history. Since the 19th century, since the beginning of the Bulgarian state, we have these quarrels between those who like Russia and those who hate Russia, Russophilia, Russophobia. In the actual parliament, there is this, I mentioned it before, the newly emerged extreme right nationalist party called Revival, Возрождане. They're openly pro-Russian and against NATO. And they have been voicing this program, pro-Russian Russophilian program, during the last couple of years. So they more or less had it on their electoral ticket. So people who are pro-Russia voted for them. They had slightly more than 1%. Slightly more than 4%. This is the threshold to enter the parliament. It's sort of like 4.8 or something percent as electoral result. But I believe this is still a minority voice. I believe we will not abandon NATO. We will not abandon the European Union. And the level of Euroscepticism in Bulgaria, although it's very visible in some publications and also in the speeches of some politicians, it will remain on the discursive level. It will not turn into actions. So geopolitically, I don't believe Bulgaria has changed orientation. Although there are attacks against politicians. You know, some politicians attack other politicians that they're being Russophilian, etc. So this happens. This is part of the normal.
But do you see Bulgaria as a NATO individual player in the Black Sea region? Because Turkey wants to be a big player in the Black Sea region. Russia, by occupying or by taking back Crimea, is a big player in the Black Sea and wants to be the only player in the Black Sea. What does Bulgaria as a state reflect on this?
We want to be part of the game, but we are a very small player. Turkey is also a NATO country, and they have a huge army. Bulgaria is a small player.
I see. Perhaps Gintautas would like to ask the last question before we end our program. I think your microphone is off.
Valentina, you mentioned, and I'm interested into Balkanian studies. I'm always with big happy to visit this former Yugoslavia republics, including your mentioned Macedonia or Greece part of Macedonia, or Kosovo as well, all the problems around this region. And ordinary, when we're talking about Macedonia problem, which you mentioned, we discuss as well Bulgarian position. There are a lot of stereotypes and very difficult to understand if you are not from this region, this Macedonian problem. What is Macedonian problems from the Bulgarian point of view, not from Greece, not from former Yugoslavia, but from Bulgarian state point of view? What does mean this Macedonian problem?
It's hard to answer this question, because if you study public opinion in Bulgaria, it will be very divided. It will be people who would say Macedonia is Bulgarian, and there will be also other people who would say, but why do we do some mean things to people that are just like us, because we stopped their entry into the EU? So there will be pro-Macedonians and against Macedonians, sort of, more or less. And there is also this very recently animated discourse about Macedonians being anti-Bulgarians. But this is like very recent. This, I believe, started like from this summer, when the political problem appeared. On the other hand, this is speaking about public opinion. If I have to speak on the position of the Bulgarian state, I'm not sure what to say, because this position is evolving. Just last week, I believe the two cabinets met, the Bulgaria and the one of the Republic of North Macedonia met. And this actual cabinet that we have, this actual prime minister that we have, they're very active precisely in the field of Bulgarian-Macedonian relationships. So I'm afraid that whatever I will say at this point will be wrong, because it is shifting right now.
I see. Well, thank you very much for your elaborate answers to our various questions, starting from religious issues and subgroups and concerts, various ecstatic experiences, and Plovdiv issues for the sexual variety of people. So thank you very much for such a big scope of your replies. And I would like to remind our dear viewers that you just watched a conversation program, freely and critically, with our special guest today from Sofia University, Valentina Gueorguieva. Thank you very much, and hope to meet you again.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.